3 million viewers watched as a powerful TV host tried to publicly humiliate Bumpy Johnson on live national television. The studio was cold, the cameras merciless, and one racist insult crossed a line that could never be walked back. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, he smiled, and in less than 4 minutes, the man holding the microphone lost everything that made him untouchable. When the cameras stop protecting you, who really holds the power, violence, silence, or the truth? 1965 New York City wasn't shaking from explosions, it was tightening from pressure. The city felt sealed shut, heat building with nowhere to escape. Civil rights marches filled the daylight hours. Television news claimed the nights. And between the two sat millions of living rooms where Americans were being taught quietly, methodically what to fear. Harlem stood at the center of that fear, not because of what happened there, but because of how it was described. On national television, Harlem stopped being a neighborhood. It became a symbol, a hot zone, a warning label. A place introduced with lowered voices and loaded pauses. No evidence required, just the right images cut the right way. The atmosphere felt like the seconds before a thunderclap. No shouting, no running, just the shared awareness that something was coming. Old rules were losing their grip. New rules hadn't been written yet. And in that gap, a different kind of power began to move. This power didn't wear a badge. It didn't carry a gun. It carried a microphone. By the mid-1960s, American television had stopped simply reporting events. It was deciding what those events meant, who was dangerous, who was respectable, who deserved to be explained, and who deserved to be condemned. A man could be judged before he ever spoke based solely on how a trusted anchor framed his name. Harlem understood the cost of that framing better than most. Here, reputation wasn't abstract. It was survival. One careless sentence on the evening news could shut doors across an entire block. A single misleading image could bring police cars faster and harsher than any call ever would. Television didn't need to touch you to do damage. It only needed to convince the rest of the country that it already understood you. Inside Midtown newsrooms, executives called this public responsibility. But behind closed doors, over cold coffee and overflowing ashtrays, the truth was simpler ratings. Attention had become currency, and fear packaged as concern sold better than facts ever did. Harlem was perfect for that kind of story. Complex history, visible poverty, long-standing resentment, a few night shots, a few carefully chosen words, a familiar anchor with the right tone of moral authority. That was all it took to turn an entire community into a backdrop for primetime anxiety. In 1965, power was no longer held exclusively by gang leaders or police commissioners. It lived in broadcast schedules and editorial meetings, in the hands of whoever decided which questions were asked and which answers never made it to air. National television became the most efficient weapon of the era, bloodless, legal, and devastating to reputations. The official records from that year read cold and precise arrests, locations, charges. They don't mention heartbeats. They don't capture the silence between sirens. They don't record what it feels like to know you're being watched by people who've never set foot on your street. The streets remembered differently. They remembered who spoke softly and kept his word, who didn't need a camera to be known, who stayed when the lights went out and the reporters moved on. Somewhere between those two worlds, between the paperwork and the pavement, between the studio lights and the sidewalk, a confrontation was being prepared, not with fists, not with weapons, but with a polite invitation printed on thick cardstock sent from a brightly lit television studio. And 1965. New York held its breath, waiting to see who would control the story when the pressure finally broke. To the police, Bumpy Johnson was a problem that refused to stay solved. Reports described him as a plague, an organizer, a gangster, a man who slipped through indictments and reappeared intact. His name circulated in precinct briefings and memo margins attached to words like numbers, control, influence. On paper, he was something to be contained. In Harlem, the language changed. Here Bumpy was spoken about the way systems are spoken about, rarely praised, never doubted. He was a protector when the heat went out in January, a provider when a rent payment came up short, a quiet presence when disputes threatened to spill into chaos. People didn't romanticize him, they relied on him, and reliance in a place trained by disappointment is the hardest trust to earn. This split wasn't an accident. It was the result of two worlds reading the same man through different needs. The police measured success by arrests and headlines. Harlem measured it by whether children made it home at night without trouble, by whether the street stayed calm when it had every reason not to. Bumpy functioned less like a boss and more like an infrastructure. He didn't shout orders across corners. He didn't posture for attention. He moved through Harlem with the assurance of someone who didn't need to announce himself. Conversations lowered when he passed. Not out of fear alone, but out of recognition. Everyone understood the rules even when they weren't written down. Silence was one of those rules. Bumpy believed noise attracted mistakes. He spoke sparingly, listened carefully, and let outcomes do the talking. Where others used threats, he used memory. Where others promised chaos, he offered predictability. That was the real power he held. The ability to make tomorrow look exactly like today in a neighborhood where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Discipline followed naturally. Those who worked around him learned quickly that recklessness was expensive, not because of punishment, but because it disrupted balance. Harlem didn't need fireworks. It needed order that didn't come with a uniform. And Bumpy understood that order only lasted if people believed in it. Respect in his world wasn't demanded, it accumulated. This was why he unnerved law enforcement. You can raid a location, you can seize money, you can lock up men. But you can't arrest a reputation that lives in hundreds of quiet decisions made every day. Bumpy survived crackdowns not by confronting them, but by outlasting them. He went to prison and came back unchanged, not louder, not bitter, just intact. That consistency mattered. In Harlem, inconsistency was the true enemy. Politicians promised help and disappeared. Programs launched and quietly ended. Police surged and withdrew. Bumpy remained. He didn't fix everything. He didn't pretend to. But he didn't leave. And in neighborhoods shaped by abandonment, staying put counted as a form of leadership. What separated Bumpy from the caricature was restraint. He didn't need to dominate rooms. He didn't need to humiliate rivals. His authority lived in the unspoken understanding that escalation was optional and usually unnecessary. Men who mistook that calm for weakness learned otherwise, often too late. But Bumpy didn't celebrate those lessons. He filed them away. This was not a man chasing applause. He distrusted attention. Cameras especially unsettled him, not because he feared exposure, but because exposure distorted truth. The lens flattened nuance. It turned systems into villains and individuals into symbols. Bumpy existed in the margins between those simplifications where real power tends to hide. Descriptions of him changed depending on who held the pen. Some saw a criminal mastermind. Others saw a stabilizing force. The details shifted with perspective, politics, and prejudice. But one thing stayed consistent across every telling. No one confused him for anything less than he was. You didn't misread Bumpy Johnson. And that certainty, the shared wordless agreement about where he stood, was exactly what made the coming confrontation so dangerous. Because when a man built on silence is dragged under bright lights, the question isn't whether he'll break. It's whether the lights will. On television, Julian Westbrook looked like order itself. Every night on City in Focus, he sat behind a polished mahogany desk, shoulders square, notes aligned, voice lowered into a baritone Americans had been trained to trust. He didn't raise it. He didn't rush. His calm suggested authority. His pauses suggested intelligence. To millions of viewers, he sounded like the country explaining itself. That was the product. Westbrook was not loud racism. He was something more efficient. His smile carried just enough warmth to disarm, just enough distance to judge. His questions arrived politely and landed like verdicts. He didn't accuse outright. He framed. And once a man was framed on Westbrook's show, the audience rarely needed evidence to reach a conclusion. This was how power spoke in 1965. Not with slurs, not with threats, but with concern, with a raised eyebrow, with a question that assumed guilt before it ever reached a question mark. Westbrook understood the mechanics perfectly. He had risen through newsrooms where credibility mattered more than truth and tone mattered more than facts. He knew that if you spoke calmly enough, you could say almost anything. He also knew something else: fear was aging, and outrage was young. The ratings told him so. By the mid-60s, the networks were feeling pressure. Younger audiences were drifting toward rawer broadcasts, grainy footage from protests, reporters shouting over crowds. Stories that felt dangerous. Westbrook's program, once untouchable, was starting to look old. Respectable. Predictable. And predictability doesn't win battles for attention. Inside, the network competition was quietly tightening. Executives didn't say ratings in meetings, they said relevance. Westbrook heard the message anyway. He needed a moment, a segment that would remind America who still controlled the conversation. He needed a villain big enough to carry an hour and safe enough to destroy. Harlem offered both. To Westbrook, Harlem wasn't a place. It was a narrative asset. And at the center of that narrative sat a man whose reputation could be reduced, simplified, and fed to viewers without backlash. A man already defined by headlines. A man the suburbs had been taught to fear. Westbrook didn't see Bumpy Johnson as a risk. He saw him as material. The plan, as he explained it privately, was simple. Bring the king of Harlem into the studio, strip away the mystique, provoke him. Let the mask slip. If Bumpy raised his voice even once, the audience would decide the rest. The police would get their mandate, the network would get its ratings, and Westbrook would reclaim his throne. He didn't say he wanted to destroy the man. He used cleaner language. He talked about exposure, about accountability, about showing the real face behind the myth, but the intent was unmistakable. He believed he could break Bumpy Johnson on live television. Because Westbrook believed in rules, studio rules, broadcast rules, his rules. In that space, Westbrook had never lost. Guests followed the script or they didn't come back. Microphones cut when answers went long. Cameras moved when reactions grew uncomfortable. The desk was his border. On his side sat legitimacy. On the other, everyone else. What Westbrook never questioned was the most dangerous assumption of all, that the rules of television were stronger than the rules of the street. That a man who commanded silence without cameras would crumble under lights. That composure came from Polish, not discipline. This was the blindness of institutional power. It mistook refinement for control. It mistook decorum for dominance. Westbrook's racism was never shouted because it didn't need to be. It lived in his certainty, in his belief that he was the final filter between chaos and civilization, in his confidence that whatever happened on his set would end with him standing centered and affirmed by applause. He had spent his career watching men shrink under his gaze. He expected no different this time, and that expectation, quiet, polished, unquestioned, was the real trap being set. The advice was unanimous. Don't go. In the quiet of the Lenox Terrace apartment, Bumpy Johnson's lieutenant said it without hesitation, without debate. This wasn't bravado or street superstition. It was strategy. They understood the terrain better than anyone in Midtown ever would. Bumpy Johnson controlled streets. Julian Westbrook controlled microphones, and microphones they knew could be sharper than knives. They laid it out plainly. Westbrook controlled the cameras. He controlled the edits. He controlled the questions, the pacing, the silences. He decided when a man looked composed and when he looked guilty. Walking into that studio meant stepping into someone else's house, under someone else's rules, with millions watching for a stumble. You don't win in there, one of them warned. You just survive or you don't. Bumpy didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He sat back in his chair, cigar resting between his fingers, the smoke rising slowly toward the ceiling. The invitation lay on the table in front of him, printed on thick cream-colored cardstock. Elegant, formal, polite in the way only institutions can be when they're preparing to humiliate you. He read it again, not for the words, but for the intent. This wasn't an interview. It was a setup. Bumpy knew the playbook. Decline the invitation and the story writes itself. Harlem boss refuses to face tough questions. Gangster afraid of the spotlight. Fear would be implied, never stated. The audience wouldn't need proof. Silence in this case would be edited into guilt. Accept, and the trap snapped shut. That was the brilliance of it. Westbrook had engineered a situation where refusal looked like weakness and participation looked like surrender. Either way, the narrative belonged to the man behind the desk. The lieutenants pressed harder. They reminded Bumpy of men who'd walked into similar rooms and never walked out the same. Careers erased, reputations frozen in a single frame. Once the country saw you flinch, that image followed you forever. Bumpy exhaled a thin stream of smoke. He had spent his entire life inside traps like this. Courtrooms, cell blocks, backroom deals that smiled before they closed. He understood something. Westbrook didn't traps only work if you panic once you're inside them. Bumpy picked up the invitation. The cardstock was heavier than it needed to be. Expensive. Designed to signal importance and superiority. He turned it over, then placed it back on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge. "I'm going," he said. The room went still. One of the men started to speak, then stopped. Another shook his head slowly. This wasn't stubbornness they were hearing. It was finality, the kind that didn't invite discussion. Bumpy explained it simply. Declining would be read as fear. And fear once assigned was impossible to shake. He had spent decades cultivating a reputation built on restraint, not intimidation, on consistency, not spectacle. Letting a television host define him as afraid would do more damage than any bad question ever could. Westbrook thought he was inviting a gangster, a caricature, a man who would stumble under polite pressure and show his teeth. "He doesn't know who he's inviting," Bumpy said quietly. "He thinks I'm coming to defend myself." He paused, then smiled. Not wide, not amused. Calculated. "Let him set the trap," he said. "I'll bring the bait." That was the moment the decision stopped being defensive and became offensive. Bumpy wasn't walking into the studio to argue. He wasn't going to shout. He wasn't going to threaten. He was going to let Westbrook do what men like Westbrook always did when given time and power. Talk too much. The lieutenants understood then. This wasn't about winning an interview. It was about letting a man reveal himself on his own terms under his own lights, with no way to edit what came next. Bumpy stood adjusting his jacket, the cigar now burning low. He had made peace with the risk. Not because he underestimated the danger, but because he understood where it really lived. In many stories about power, the trap isn't hidden in a cell or a dark alley. It's hidden in an invitation that looks respectable enough to accept. And Bumpy Johnson had never been afraid of walking through the front door. The morning of the interview arrived colder than it should have been. An unseasonable chill moved through Harlem, sharp enough to sting the face and linger in the lungs. Winter wasn't supposed to feel like this in early fall, but then again, neither was what waited downtown. Bumpy Johnson noticed the cold and took it as information, not inconvenience. He prepared the way a general prepares before a campaign, not in a rush, not with ceremony, with intention. The suit came first, Italian tailoring charcoal gray cut clean and narrow at the shoulders, expensive without announcing itself. the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle under pressure. A crisp white shirt followed, pressed sharp enough to hold its line through a long night. Around his neck, a burgundy silk tie, dark and restrained. No patterns, no distractions. Authority didn't need decoration. The fedora was last. He set it at a precise angle, one that signaled control to anyone who knew how to read men. Too straight looked timid. Too low looked theatrical. This was exact. Measured. Final. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a gangster. He didn't see a defendant. He saw what Julian Westbrook feared most and rarely encountered an equal who understood the room before stepping into it. The message of the outfit was simple. I belong wherever I choose to stand. That message mattered. In 1965, appearance wasn't vanity. It was armor. Harlem had taught him that. Men were judged before they spoke, before they moved, before they explained themselves. Clothing didn't make power, but it announced whether you expected to be respected. Bumpy checked his cuffs, straightened his tie once more, and turned away from the mirror. The decision had already been made. This was execution, not rehearsal. Outside, the black Cadillac waited at the curb engine, idling low. As it pulled away from Lenox Avenue, Harlem unfolded in the windows, brownstones, corner stores, men leaning into the cold with collars turned up. This was familiar territory, predictable, honest in its struggles. Then the car crossed 110th Street. The shift was immediate, not dramatic, subtle, like crossing a border no one admitted existed. Buildings grew taller, sidewalks widened, the faces changed. The rhythm of the streets tightened. Jazz gave way to traffic reports. Survival gave way to schedules. Midtown didn't hum. It marched. Steel and glass replaced brick and memory. Men in identical coats moved with purpose, eyes forward, never lingering. This was a different ecosystem, one where power wore suits and spoke softly, and mistakes were buried under committees and press releases. Bumpy watched it all pass without comment. He understood borders. He had crossed them his entire life, sometimes invited, sometimes not. What interested him wasn't the contrast, but the illusion. Midtown believed it was insulated from Harlem, that its problems were distant, contained. Television had helped sell that belief. The Cadillac slowed near Rockefeller Center. Even before the car stopped, Bumpy could feel it, the tension of a place unused to men like him, arriving by choice. This wasn't a back entrance. This was the front door. He adjusted the brim of his hat once more. Not for style, for alignment. Details mattered even when they couldn't be documented later. There would be no receipts saved for historians. No ledger proving which tailor cut the suit or which shop sold the tie. Those facts would fade, but the message wouldn't. Everyone who saw him step out of that car would understand it instantly. He hadn't come to apologize. He hadn't come to explain himself. He hadn't come dressed for mercy. In stories about power, not every detail survives the record. Some disappear into rumor, others blur with time. But certain signals cut through everything, signals every man recognizes whether he admits it or not. Clothes can't make you equal, but they can make it impossible to pretend you aren't. And as Bumpy Johnson prepared to walk through the doors of national television, that was the only message he needed to deliver before a single camera ever turned on. The black Cadillac eased to a stop beneath the lights of Rockefeller Center. The building rose like a monument to certainty, stone, steel, and glass arranged to suggest permanence. This was not a place that expected to be questioned. It was a place that expected compliance. The doorman hesitated. It was a small pause, almost polite, long enough to glance at the driver, long enough to glance back at the man in the back seat. His hand hovered near the handle, then opened the door without offering assistance. No greeting. No courtesy. Just space cold and deliberate. Bumpy Johnson stepped out anyway. Inside, the lobby stretched upward like a cathedral built for commerce. Marble floors polished to a mirror, gold accents catching the light. Footsteps echoing in a way that made every arrival feel announced. Secretaries crossed the floor with files pressed to their chests. Executives moved in tight lines, eyes forward, schedules intact. Then the noise softened. Heads turned. Conversations stalled. Eyes tracked the movement they weren't accustomed to seeing. It wasn't hostility yet, just assessment. The look people give something that doesn't belong to their routine. A black man in a suit that cost more than the guard's annual salary, walking with the ease of someone who didn't ask permission. That was the offense. At the reception desk, a young woman straightened her posture and offered a tight smile, the kind trained to conceal uncertainty. "Mr. Johnson," she said, voice pitched higher than necessary. "Mr. Westbrook is expecting you." She glanced past him. "Security will need to check you." Two guards stepped forward. Ex-cops by the look of them, thick necks, practiced scowls, hands drifting toward their belts. One closed the distance too quickly, arms spreading as if the rules were already settled. Bumpy raised a hand. Not sharply, not urgently, just enough. "I am a guest of Mr. Westbrook," he said, his voice low and even. It carried. The lobby heard it. "I was invited." The guard didn't move. "I'm unarmed," Bumpy continued. "My men are unarmed." He let the words land before adding the condition. "If you touch me, I will turn around. I will walk out that door. And tonight, 3 million people will stare at an empty chair. By morning, someone will need a new job." The guard hesitated. The receptionist paled. A clock ticked somewhere behind the desk. Live television didn't wait for misunderstandings. The guard stepped back. The smile returned to the receptionist's face, thinner now. "Right this way," she whispered, already moving. They passed down long corridors lined with framed portraits, anchors, politicians, actors. Almost all white. Almost all smiling with the confidence of men who had never been challenged in this building. Doors stood ajar. Typing stopped as they passed. Faces appeared in glass. Whispers followed like a wake. "That's him. The gangster. The problem. The man who wasn't supposed to be here." Bumpy walked on without acknowledging any of it. He didn't rush. He didn't slow. He understood the language being spoken without words. Some places don't need signs that say "keep out." They rely on looks, on pauses, on the expectation that you'll decide for yourself to leave. He didn't. By the time they reached the studio corridor, the message had been delivered clearly, unmistakably. He was inside now, not because he was welcomed, but because he refused to accept the role assigned to him, and in buildings like this, refusal is the first act of defiance. The green room was smaller than it needed to be. Beige walls, a single table, a bowl of fruit left too long under hot light, skin's dulled edges soft. It wasn't neglect, it was design. A reminder delivered quietly of where guests like this were expected to wait. Bumpy Johnson didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes moving slowly along the walls. He understood the message immediately. Senators and movie stars waited elsewhere in rooms with champagne and flowers. This one was meant to shrink him before the cameras ever turned on. 10 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Julian Westbrook stepped in like a man entering a lab. He didn't extend a hand. He didn't cross the room. He stayed near the door, maintaining distance, assessing. In person, he was taller than he appeared on television, groomed to precision hair, fixed into place, cologne heavy with confidence. "Mr. Johnson," Westbrook said, voice neutral, clinical. "I'm glad you decided to show up." He paused, letting the implication breathe. "We had a backup segment on the botanical gardens ready to go. Frankly, we weren't sure you had the nerve. It was a clean strike. Polite. Delivered with a smile that suggested reasonableness. Westbrook had done this before established dominance, early framed compliance as courage. I've never been accused of lacking nerve, Bumpy replied, turning to face him. Westbrook chuckled, humorless. The streets are one thing, he said. This is national television, different arena. There are rules here. He took a step closer, voice lowering into instruction. Decorum. Clarity. We'll be discussing serious matters, no street slang. Speak clearly. Our audience isn't used to your dialect. Try to articulate. We don't want to have to subtitle you. It landed exactly as intended. Not as an insult, those could be challenged, but as guidance, a reminder of who set standards and who was expected to rise to them. Bumpy's expression didn't change. I'll do my best to make myself understood, he said calmly. Then he added softly, Julian. The name was deliberate. Westbrook stiffened. His smile tightened. Mr. Westbrook, he corrected. On air. We'll see, Bumpy said. The moment passed quickly, but something had shifted. Westbrook searched for a reaction that didn't arrive. No anger, no defensiveness, just patience. It unsettled him more than a raised voice ever could. Westbrook scoffed and turned for the door. 5 minutes, he said over his shoulder. Don't be late. When the door closed, the room exhaled. Nat Pettigrew stepped forward, fists clenching. Let me break his jaw, he growled. Just once. Bumpy adjusted his cuff eyes, still on the door. No, he said. That's what he wants. Nat looked confused. He wants the brute, Bumpy continued. He wants the animal. If I hit him, I give him the ending he's already written. A knock sounded. A stage manager peeked in, pale headset askew. Mr. Johnson, we're ready. Bumpy nodded and reached for his jacket. He hadn't come to fight. He hadn't come to plead. He had come to let a man with a microphone reveal how power really speaks when it thinks it's safe. On television, humiliation is rarely labeled as such. It's packaged as production advice and delivered with a smile. The red light blinked on. Inside the studio, heat from the lamps pressed down like a physical weight. Cameras rolled forward on silent wheels. Boom microphones hovered overhead. Beyond the lit circle of the set sat the audience, nearly all white, arranged in neat rows, faces expectant, curious, ready to be instructed on what they were about to see. At center stage, Julian Westbrook settled behind his desk leather chair, cushioned and elevated. Across from him stood a single wooden chair. No padding, no armrests. Hard angles. Another detail chosen with care. Bumpy Johnson walked to it without hesitation. He sat. He crossed his legs. He folded his hands. He looked comfortable. The countdown ended. Good evening, Westbrook began, voice transforming instantly into the trusted baritone America recognized. Tonight on City in Focus, we take you inside the dark heart of Harlem, a world of vice, violence, and criminal control. He paused, letting the words settle. And seated across from me is the man police call its cancer, Ellsworth Johnson, known on the streets as Bumpy. Westbrook turned toward him with practiced gravity. Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us, though I suppose I should check my wallet before we begin. Laughter rippled through the audience. Light, comfortable, approved. Westbrook smiled. The first point had been scored. Bumpy didn't react. He waited until the laughter thinned, until the room remembered itself. Then he spoke evenly. You can check your wallet if you like, Mr. Westbrook. But the only people in this city who steal from the poor sit in banks downtown, not on the streets of Harlem. The room went quiet. Westbrook's smile faltered just long enough to be seen by the camera operators. He hadn't expected resistance. He hadn't expected a pivot. He cleared his throat and moved on. Let's talk facts, he said. Police records describe you as a predator, a man who runs an illegal numbers racket that drains milk money from starving families. He gestured lightly toward Bumpy's suit. How do you justify taking from your own people to dress like this? Bumpy leaned forward an inch. Not aggressive, intentional. The numbers game, he said, is the poor man's stock market. He spoke slowly, choosing clarity over speed. Wall Street gambles every day with millions. When they crash the economy, they get rescued. When a woman in Harlem puts a dime on a number hoping to pay rent, the police kick down her door. Westbrook snapped back. Because it's against the law. And why is it against the law uptown, but called business downtown? Bumpy asked. Because the rules change, depending on who benefits. A murmur moved through the audience, uneasy, now uncertain whether to agree or recoil. Westbrook felt it slipping. He pressed harder. You're responsible for violence, he said. For blood on Harlem sidewalks. Do you deny men have suffered on your orders? I deny that I am the cause, Bumpy replied. Violence is born of poverty, of desperation, of a system that refuses to hire a man, then punishes him for surviving. Westbrook shifted in his chair. This wasn't the script. This wasn't the man he'd invited. He tried again, pointing at the suit. Italian tailoring, he said with a sneer. Paid for by milk money. Bumpy didn't look down. The same way your advertisers pay for this desk, he said. With money extracted from people who don't have a seat at it. The red light burned brighter. Westbrook realized then that he wasn't hosting an interview. He was sharing a stage with a man who understood the exchange and refused to play small. The audience sat frozen between two truths, unsure which one the show was meant to deliver. A single live broadcast was doing what reports and indictments never could. It was revealing how power spoke when challenged, and how little patience it had for being answered back. Julian Westbrook stopped pretending. The smile faded. The careful pauses vanished. What replaced them was impatience, the sound a man makes when he realizes control is slipping through his fingers. He leaned forward, elbows near the edge of the desk, voice sharpening. You talk a lot about systems, he said, dismissive now. But let's be honest. You're not an educated man, Mr. Johnson. You learned life in prison, not in a library. You're a thug who got lucky. Do you really think you have the intellectual capacity to lecture this audience about economics? The studio stilled. Bumpy Johnson didn't answer. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He let the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to replace anticipation. Long enough for Westbrook to feel the weight of his own words echoing back at him. Then Bumpy spoke. I may not have a degree from Harvard, he said quietly, but I have a degree from Sing Sing. He paused. I read history in a cell where most men learn to shout. You read teleprompters. History teaches me this: men like you always believe you own the moment, right up until the moment changes. Westbrook's face flushed. He had underestimated him. Again, he needed something decisive, something irreversible. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial register, meant to sound compassionate, and cut deeper. Let's talk about your daughter, he said. You send her to good schools. You dress her like a princess. But no matter what you do, she'll never be accepted. She'll always be the daughter of a criminal. Of a primitive. He paused, savoring the cruelty. Do you really think dirty money can wash that stain off her skin? The air left the room. The audience gasped. Camera operators froze. Even the lights seemed harsher, more exposed. This wasn't journalism. It was something else, raw, deliberate, and broadcast live to millions. Westbrook leaned back, convinced he'd finally pressed the button. Bumpy went very still. He reached into his jacket, not quickly, not theatrically, and withdrew a silver cigarette case. The guards tensed. Hands hovered. He opened it, struck a match, and lit his cigar. The flame flared, then died. He drew once and exhaled, letting the smoke drift across the desk and into Westbrook's space. You made a mistake, Julian, Bumpy whispered. The producer's voice screamed through Westbrook's earpiece, cut to commercial cut now, but Westbrook couldn't move. He was locked in the gaze across from him, realizing too late that the room had turned. Bumpy checked his watch. We have 3 minutes, he said. That's enough. He reached into his jacket again and placed a folded slip of paper on the desk. You like calling my business a sin, he continued calmly. But you enjoy the track at Saratoga. The private card games at the plaza. He tapped the paper. This is a receipt. $50,000. Last Tuesday. Owed to a man in Hell's Kitchen named S. Westbrook's mouth opened. Nothing came out. You didn't invite me here to expose Harlem, Bumpy said. You invited me to save yourself. You thought humiliating me on live television would get you a bonus enough to pay off your debt before the sharks noticed. The audience murmured, unsure whether to breathe. You're not a journalist, Bumpy said, voice firm now. You're a gambler. And tonight you bet your career against the truth. Westbrook snapped. Cut the feed, he screamed, voice cracking. His chair tipped as he scrambled back, sending him to the floor in a heap of soot and panic. The red light stayed on. Bumpy stood, unfolded a crisp $100 bill and let it fall onto Westbrook's chest. For a cab, he said. As he turned to leave, the studio remained frozen, millions of viewers watching a man lose everything without a hand ever being raised. What they saw was a moment. What followed would be a chain of decisions no one would publicly sign their name to. By morning, the story had already been rewritten. The network didn't call it a firing. They never did. The press release used softer language: resignation due to health reasons. No explanation. No follow-up. Julian Westbrook's name vanished from the schedule before sunrise. His photo came down from the hallway walls. By noon, it was as if he had never sat behind that desk at all. The newspapers were less careful. Within hours, the gambling debt surfaced. $50,000, then more. Old markers. Quiet loans. The image collapsed in reverse, first the moral authority, then the respectability, finally the sympathy. The same papers that once printed his opinions now printed his liabilities. His wife left within the week, taking the children somewhere quieter, somewhere safer, somewhere without microphones. Westbrook tried to fight back. He talked about slander, about lawsuits, about context. No lawyer returned his calls, not because the case was unwinnable, but because no one wanted their name attached to a man the city had already decided to forget. 3 weeks later, he was seen downtown near the Port Authority. The suit was wrinkled, the voice gone. He tried to buy into a small card game in the back of a deli. The answer was brief. Credit no good. There was no violence, no threats, no final confrontation. Just doors that didn't open anymore. When word reached Harlem, Bumpy Johnson didn't react. He didn't celebrate. He didn't comment. He simply said what he always said when a story ended on its own. No need to finish a job that's already done. A man like Westbrook didn't need punishment. He needed attention. Without the camera, without the chair, without the audience that made him matter, he was already finished, reduced to a voice no one waited to hear. The city moved on. It always does. And it tells these stories its own way, sometimes colder, sometimes crueler, and often more final than any broadcast ever dared to be. There was no punch that night, no shouting, no chase, just a wooden chair, a red light, and one man who understood that television is also a battlefield. Westbrook entered the broadcast as a judge. He left it as a defendant while still sitting in front of the camera. Harlem didn't celebrate. Harlem remembered one simple rule: when someone uses a microphone to humiliate, the microphone eventually exposes them. Bumpy Johnson didn't win with violence. He won with discipline and with truth delivered at the exact moment it could no longer be edited. Some stories don't need a courtroom to end. They close themselves when the lights come on, and no one ever looks at you the same way again. If you value stories where power is examined, not glorified, subscribe to the channel. These records stay open only if people keep watching. Do you think Bumpy Johnson truly won that night? Or did the camera simply expose a system that was already rotting? If Westbrook had stayed silent, would the outcome have been different? Let me know whether power today still hides behind microphones, or if the rules have finally changed.